Thank you. I'm sorry I have to speak in English, but I want to start by saying if you're not wearing a tinfoil hat, you're not paying attention. Thank you. Okay. So, the elites of this world have decided it's time for the final solution, and they're taking it over. And they found that the WHO Constitution and the way the WHO and UN are set up made them, particularly the WHO, an ideal mechanism for taking control. And two new documents that I'm sure you've heard about, amendments to the international health regulations, which will completely change the meaning of that document, and a completely new pandemic treaty, which is now being called an accord, and it has several other names to keep the population confused, have been put forward, but louder, sorry. These documents were created by the staff of the WHO, by the US State Department, and by many members of the WHO, because as we know, most of the diplomats and politicians are already owned. And the two documents are now going to be binding, which means nations will be required to obey. Initially, human rights and freedom of persons were removed from the existing international health regulations. And instead, diversity, equity, inclusion were added, which don't really have a legal meaning. There were so many complaints about that in the latest version, which is the third or fourth version of the treaty, those words got put back. But this is not the final version. There are many, many problems with these two documents, which partially overlap each other. They require that every nation must perform surveillance on its population, two kinds of surveillance. They have to swab you to find out if you may have a pandemic pathogen or if you have a potential pandemic pathogen. Of course, anything can be a potential pandemic pathogen. And the Director General in the drafts that are available now, but may not be, they're not going to be the final draft, but the existing drafts, which is all we can read, say that the Director General can declare an emergency if he finds even a potential pandemic pathogen. And under those conditions, he or she can tell us what drugs we're allowed to have and what drugs we will not be allowed to have. Your nation must also swab animals, wastewater, and the environment, constantly looking for these things. According to the treaty draft, the nations are supposed to build genomics laboratories all around the world, check out the genomes of these potential pandemic pathogens that they must constantly look for, and if they find them, they must share them. Okay, so a potential pandemic pathogen or a pandemic pathogen found in the environment could be a biological warfare agent. That's another word for it. And the WHO demands that these things be sought for and shared. That is proliferation of a weapon of mass destruction. It is illegal according to the Biological Weapons Convention and other international documents. But that's what the treaty calls for, countries to create biological weapons and share them. They're not sharing them with our populations, they'll share them with the governments or the WHO. There must be surveillance of your social media and media. Only the WHO narrative on health is allowed to be put forth. Now, while the new amendments to the international health regulations, and we don't know how many there will be, there have been over 300 proposed. These new amendments will only be in effect when a pandemic or a public health emergency of international concern is declared. However, the pandemic treaty will be in force all the time. You don't need to declare anything. The Director General of the WHO will be able to direct all the countries, the 194 members of the World Health Assembly, to manage their health the way the Director General says all the time. There's another very problematic section of the proposed treaty, and that is, it gives the WHO a blank check. It states that a conference of the parties will be created with 30 some odd members, and they will make the rules for how this document will be used, what the rules are for other countries. But they haven't created this committee, they haven't made any rules, and they're asking all the nations to just give them a blank check. This is what we're looking at. There's going to be a new version of the treaty probably coming up later in October. There may be new amendments. At the end of the day, in May, the nations are supposed to vote on these two documents, but there may be no vote at all. Instead, they will change the wording of the documents, and we may never see the final version before they're decided on. And they may not vote. They are likely to just have a consensus procedure, this is what happened last year to some newer amendments, where the chairman of the meeting asks if anyone has any objections, and he waits 3 seconds and then bangs his gavel down, and then the document is passed. So that's what that's what we must expect. And we have to stop them before that happens, but we also need to tell them if it does happen, because it could, because they own all these diplomats and many heads of state. If it happens, we have to tell them we're not obeying. We won't go along with it. And we'll do everything we need to do. Thank you.